Hi, everyone, and welcome to EDEC 233's Class 9. We're talking about Indigenous settler relations and teaching in and out of classrooms this week. And we have a guest joining us for a guest lecture, and I will let Wayne introduce himself.
My name is Wayne Robinson. I am a member of the Biigtigong Nishnaabeg community. We're an Ojibway Nation in Northern Ontario. That being said, I spend not a lot of time in my community, so more identify as Urban Indigenous.
Okay. Can you tell us more about the work that you do?
Yeah, so for the last 20 years, I've been working in the social services, definitely with a focus on racialized communities. And in the last 8 years, I've been very much focused on the Urban Indigenous community here in Montreal. Through a series of different organizations, some focusing on student involved and homeless Indigenous peoples, and some focusing on the greater Montreal Indigenous community, working with a lot of students.
Okay. Yep. Cool. Thanks. Can you talk to us more about the work you do and how identity fits into that?
So one of the things I should disclose that I grew up not wanting to be Indigenous. You know, I grew up with a lot of what I call internalized colonialism. So for me, growing up, being Indigenous was not a positive thing in my life. Being Indigenous was something that I didn't find strength in. Instead, I think I found a lot of problematic issues. Mostly because what I saw I saw Indigenous peoples, there were two main narratives growing up. One being our Indigenous peoples downtown, who are often student involved with homeless, who are often dealing with significant amount of addictions or other barriers that I now work in the communities to try to resolve. But the other narrative was this idea of like the wood nymph, you know, the Indigenous peoples being a part of nature. And you know, as an urban guy, it's something I really didn't identify with. Mm-hmm. So seeing these two narratives, and I didn't see myself reflected in either one of them, it allowed me to really hate being a native, and have a lot of issues with that. I also feel that I have a lot of like, this is where I'd usually talk about the difference between Indigenous identity and Indigenous experience. So when we're talking about Indigenous identity, really the best example I can show you is I can pull out of my wallet right now my Indian status card that says I'm an enrolled member of a band. We can talk about blood quantum. You know, I'm as far as I know 100% native on both sides, Ojibway, so I'm 100% native. And that looks different for a lot of Indigenous peoples. Because of a lot of the experiences our communities have had, because people might have been displaced from their community and may not have that connection to community. Some people might have different lineages. There's a lot of questions around it. It's really hard to say who's Indigenous and who's not. I think we're from a lot of beautiful Indigenous cultures, and just to celebrate that's really around identity. Nowadays, I'm very proud to be a part of the Ojibway Nation. I'm proud of the language that I have not obtained. I'm proud of our cultural celebrations. These things are things to celebrate a lot of times. The fact that we don't have them, I mean, that this is a result of the genocide perpetuated on Indigenous peoples. But when we're talking about that genocide and that loss of culture, which I think a lot of people focus on, what I want to focus on is this idea of the Indigenous experience. So how did those, that movement, that situation happening in the Indigenous people, how does that play out in people's lives right now? So one of the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years is I've done these Indigenous 101s. So I work with different organizations, be it community organizations, colleges, universities, CJABs, the SPBM. I've had a long relationship, you know, working with the police, which is a very hard place to be as somebody who often talks about the historical challenge relationship between police services and Indigenous peoples. But yeah, having to work with a lot of different groups, from like student groups to community groups to, you know, horrible police officers. It also meant that I had to really tailor this conversation and talk about lot of concepts and issues. And one of the things I realized is the way you could really best articulate it is set aside that issue of identity. You know, are we looking at that issue of identity again as something that's a positive, something that can build strength in peoples? But what we're really looking at, and the reason why we're reconciling, is because it's not because we have a beautiful culture, language, history. We're reconciling because that was taken away, that there was a systemic genocide perpetuated on Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And what are the effects of those? What does that look like today? I think a lot of people have this notion that any negative relations between Indigenous peoples and settlers happened 500 years ago at the time of European colonizers coming to North America. The fact is that's simply not as simple or clear-cut. Instead, what we see is a lot of what happened over the last 150 years playing out. And this is when we move from a nation-to-nation relationship to a more paternalistic relationship, where Indigenous peoples no longer have sovereignty and that right to be who they are, and instead have a relationship where really an attempted genocide was perpetrated on Indigenous peoples. And these concepts are really hard. They're really hard to talk about. They're really hard to understand what the effects of these are. And a lot of times what I'll talk about is the idea of intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is often a concept that is really hard to explain or to talk about how it might affect Indigenous peoples today. So I do it by really talking about two people. One of them is Adele Desmoulins, and the other is Claire Rivers. Adele Desmoulins is my maternal grandmother's, my mom's mom. Adele was born and raised in our community. Before it was called Biigtigong Nishnaabeg, it was called Pic River First Nations. We're doing a bit of language reclamation. And Adele's story was one that she grew up in our community. She actually turned to the Catholic religion and was not a fan of teaching that language as she knew to her children. And as a result, I never learned Ojibway because of that. And was that just a choice? Was that... There was a lot of factors in place to why that might have happened, but there is one way where the language was cut off. My grandma was not born a Roman Catholic. It was something that happened over time and something that had a lot of negative consequences, and that affects me to this day. That being said, it wasn't the biggest effect Adele had on my life. My mom was sick when I was growing up, so and we had a lot of challenges with child protective agencies ourselves, so a lot of times we were sent to live with relatives, and I would spend a lot of my summers and sometimes during the year with Adele in our community. And when I was a child, Adele was murdered by another member of our community. And this has had really a grave effect on myself. I can see that now. It had a horrible effect on my aunts, my uncles, my mom, a trauma that we feel today. So, when we talk about things like the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis that Canada is facing right now, I'm feeling the effects of that. Having my grandmother murdered is something that affects me on a daily basis. The other person I want to talk about was Claire. Claire Rivers was my father's mom. As horrible as to say, and it's worse to feel, Claire was one of the meanest people I've ever met. Claire had said some really hurtful things to me as a child. Claire had treated my dad really horribly. Claire had upwards of 12 children. The vast majority entered the Child Protective Services. The vast majority grew up in homes where there was a significant amount of abuse and violence. And one of the things my dad has shared with me is that, because he was one of the ones that were adopted at birth, I've asked him, do you ever want to find out who your real dad is? And his answer has always been, Claire inflicted so much pain on me. Why would I want to find out who my dad is? So I detested Claire for a lot of my life. She passed away quite a while ago now, and I remember feeling when she died that I was happy. I didn't feel sadness. I'm like, good, she's an evil, horrible person, and it's good that she's gone. And for years I felt that way, and it was only in the last decade that on September 30th, which is Orange T-shirt Day, it's a day we recognize the survivors of the residential school system. One of my big, tough uncles who, you know, he looks like a biker, he's this huge guy in and out of jail, and, you know, he doesn't share a lot of, like, empathetic, sympathetic things. And on Facebook he shared, you know, today I wear an orange shirt. I wear an orange shirt because my mother went to a residential school. I never knew this about Claire, so what I did is I investigated. I found out that she went to a residential school outside of Espanola. This residential school was really one of the most notorious in Canada for sexual and physical violence, and it reframed who Claire was. It reframed Claire's experience. Claire was a child when she was taken away from her family, brought to the school with very rampant amounts of physical and sexual violence, and now this lady who at one point I detested and hated, I can better sympathize and understand. This was somebody who was likely raped as a child. This was someone who's likely felt all those negative actions that residential schools inflicted on children. And it reframed my entire way that I thought about Claire. It reframed the way that I thought about myself. And it really helped me to personally understand what intergenerational trauma was. I didn't go to an Indian residential school. My dad didn't go to an Indian residential school. But that pain that was inflicted on children in that school played out in our lives every day. What kind of father would my dad had been if he hadn't had the experiences inflicted on him? I still think Claire did a lot of really mean things to our family as children. But it also becomes abundantly clear that Claire also had these horrible experiences that happened in the last, you know, the last residential school closed in 1996. I would have been 16 in 1996, which means I could have been somebody who went to a residential school and had that same kind of pain inflicted on me. So a lot of times I think when you're trying to explain residential school or intergenerational trauma, it's easy to talk about, oh, these are just bad schools, or like, this is the missing murdered Indigenous women crisis, this is how it affects Indigenous peoples, but it's different when you experience it and when you look at what that experience played out in. And I can talk later about how that affected me looking back on it even more so later on. But yeah, so that was a bit of an overshare, but
no, thank you. I think that's really important to know, because abstractly these things can be hard to grasp, especially the severity and this idea of intergenerational impact. I would say thank you for sharing. And also, speaking of schools, because I think there's also the idea you talked about that colonization happened in the past, and similarly with residential schools, there's the idea that if residential schools closed, even if it was more recent than people think, that they're done, and that kind of impact is not around, but also that education no longer plays a role in colonization. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on your experiences with schools?
Well, you know, the first way I like to frame it is understanding where I am. You know, right now, for the last 20 years, I've been working in social services. The social services have played a really big impact on Indigenous peoples. You know, when we talk about Indigenous peoples overrepresentation within child protective services, those are social service workers that have inflicted that pain. I now work for an institution that was an agent of the genocide perpetuated on my peoples. You know, I often sit and share tables with other people, and these people were also agents of the genocide inflicted on my people. So then, if we're also looking at schools, you know, we often talk about probably the biggest factor in the genocide of Indigenous peoples in a Canadian context was the residential schools. So we also have to be very clear that schools are institutions that perpetuated a genocide on Indigenous peoples. Schools were set up and became a tool to really attempt to genocide us, which also means that teachers are a part of that. You might not be in a system right now where you're inflicting a kind of pain that was inflicted on my grandmother, but know that you're still working within that legacy of genocide that is woven within the development of our school system, woven in the development of our social service organizations. So knowing that going in, I think is important to know. Knowing that as much as, we want to say schools are these very progressive places where great things can happen, know that for Indigenous peoples, for a lot of racialized peoples, you are actually an agent of an institution that's done great pain. Mm-hmm. Personally, I'm a high school dropout. I'll also share that I was student involved and homeless from the time I was 15. I had a challenging relationship with my family. And one of the really ironic things, one of the sticking points that me and my father especially had was my father was not successful in school. My father was also a dropout. My mother was a dropout. My father hated the educational institutions. I don't know if he would know how to articulate that hate, but the way it was articulated to me is that he would laugh at me for wanting to go to school. He would say that that's not something we do. He was very upset that I chose to continue education as long as I did, even though I dropped out, rather than working with him in construction. He had so little value on education. I think it's easier for me to frame why that is now. If you look at his experience with education, definitely looking at his mom's experience with education systems, him never having a space where he felt accepted in those institutions, of course he wouldn't want his children to have that pain inflicted on them. Mm-hmm. And even as somebody who's worked in the field and worked with a lot of Indigenous families, we see the same thing. There's not a valorization of academia. There's not this idea that this is a positive space to be. Mm-hmm. So when you're working with Indigenous students, you're not only dealing with the student, you're dealing with the history and legacy of colonization and genocide perpetuated on Indigenous peoples, which each child student that you see in front of you. Mm-hmm. So it creates this system where it's really hard to move forward. And I can understand for people that are moving into a career in education that seems like a daunting challenge. Mm-hmm. How do we both acknowledge the pain the educational institutions have done on Indigenous communities, while at the same time being a part of those educational institutions? And I think the first thing to do is acknowledge it, to understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you talk more about this idea of moving forward and acknowledging and what that looks like in these institutions with this history?
I think we're progressing to a place where ideally things are getting better. We always want to go at it with this idea that things could get better, that classes like this exist, working with educators that they can understand these issues and hopefully develop their own paradigms where they can, and practices where they can really institute Indigenous knowledge, or at least have an understanding of the Indigenous experience when they are educators themselves. But the question is, what do we look at? What does it look like right now? Mm-hmm. So I can share an example of a school that I worked with. I worked with Billings High School, which is part of the New Frontier School Board in Chateauguay, so the South Shore. Chateauguay, Quebec, for anybody knows, it's right across the bridge. And its neighbors the community of Ganawage, which is a Mohawk community there. For a lot of Ganawage's history, if children wanted to go to school, they would have to take the bus into Chateauguay. They now have these really amazing schools on their community themselves. Mm-hmm. But still a lot of children go to Chateauguay. A lot of children go to Billings High School. And in Billings High School, they have a population of 30% Indigenous students. In working with both the New Frontier School Board and the Billings High School itself, with the administration, they were able to very easily identify that that academic world was failing Indigenous children. That Indigenous children were more likely to be expelled. Indigenous children were less likely to be academically successful within that school. And the school would often identify problematic behavior with Indigenous children. So they actually got a funding through the Quebec Education Ministry for a language class, or a language program. This was called NEST, the Native Education Support Team. And what it was a classroom where Indigenous children that needed help, Indigenous students that needed help with language, would go to this class. They could go, if they were in another class, they could be excused from that class to go to this classroom and work with them. But I think the really interesting part is they took the view that these language issues went beyond just that classroom, just that subject, and they used the NEST program as a way to engage people like myself, who was working in Native Montreal at the time, to come into class to provide psychosocial supports for these Indigenous children. So it was a language class that had made space for an Indigenous worker from the community to come in to work with those communities, to work with those students, and those students could often see themselves reflected in me. Right. You know, I could share stories about my own experience with education, and I feel that created a real trusting relationship. And they had some amazing teachers that were part of this program. We were also able to bring in drama therapists, and the drama therapists were able to work one-on-one with students during these times to really address this intergenerational trauma that was being played out in their lives, in something that so I think that's one example where you have an academic institution who was given funding very specifically for a language program, but they were really able to make an argument that you know, language is what they're hoping to improve, but it's more of a psychosocial supports that were needed for these Indigenous students. We've also, I could also talk about bad examples too. One of the things, you know, when I talked earlier about one of the narratives of Indigenous peoples that I didn't feel connected with was this idea around identity. And one of them was the wood nymph, what I often talk about, this mystical being who dances naked in the forest, you know. And as an urban person, like, it's something that I didn't connect with. This idea that Indigenous people are spiritual people. So most schools in Montreal and Quebec have what they call a spiritual animator. They're there, they work in these institutions, and oftentimes they're there to connect with different students and talk about spiritual issues, talk about well-being, talk about, you know, it's a great program, I think, within the schools. But one thing we realized time and again, if an Indigenous child was having any issue, like, oh, Indigenous, they must be spiritual, let's connect it with the spiritual animator. So it wasn't guidance departments calling me, it wasn't other intervention workers calling me to come in, it was these spiritual animators who, again, did a great job, but I mean, it always struck me funny that, like, how come I'm not getting this call from guidance? This is definitely issues that this Indigenous student is having around, you know, challenges at home, they weren't going to the spiritual animator and saying, like, you know, I need guidance, you know, connecting with my spirit animal. They were going there and being like, I don't have food to eat today. Why were you referred to a spiritual animator? Wouldn't that go through guidance? But because they were Indigenous and because we have they're like, okay, this child needs spiritual help. Wow. So again, you know, I don't think it's the worst case scenario, but I think we really need to start looking at the Indigenous experience. It is not being something related to our identity, and more so related to the fact that, again, a genocide was perpetrated on Indigenous peoples, a genocide for the benefit of settlers who came here. And this all stems from the loss of the nation-to-nation relationship, the loss of autonomy of Indigenous peoples to have control over our lives, and really the bringing of this paternalistic relationship between the state of Canada and Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. Thank
Sorry,
you.
I know I kind of got ranty there.
No, I think that ties in really well to conversations we've been having, and I would ask you also, thinking of you know, how to support students in particular, but also how to shift some of these institutions. what do you think the role of these historically non-Indigenous institutions is when they're trying to start implementing things like mandatory Indigenous education courses or mandatory kind of land acknowledgements on every...
This is exactly what I wanted to talk about. One of the things that my thoughts have grown and have been challenged on is, about 10 years ago, we had a trend across North America, especially in Canada, in academic settings, of this idea of a land acknowledgement. And at the beginning of it, I was often consulted by different organizations that wanted to develop their own land acknowledgement. They wanted it to be meaningful, which is a very key term, meaningful. So they would consult with me and other Indigenous peoples, like, what is the history of this land? What do we want to say? And we worked really hard to craft these powerful statements. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, that's all they were. They were statements. So there were people coming in and saying, this is the traditional land of the Ganagawage, this was what's called Geogakte. Also Munyang is another Nishnaabeg name for the community. And they would acknowledge that settlers had caused great harm to Indigenous peoples. But then it stopped. It was admitting something was really horrible. Well, that's fine, but what help does it do? It really doesn't do it. If it is not concretely and meaningfully tied to actions, all you're doing is making fun of Indigenous peoples. To an extent, all you're doing is saying, we did something horrible, we're implicit in this horrible action that's been created, but we're just going to talk about it. Like, I mean, now you have really what I talk about is like you have the burden of knowledge. It's one thing if there's a person standing around saying like, I don't believe Canada did anything bad, because they would never make a land acknowledgement. Yeah, of course they're not going to do anything because they don't see that something bad has happened. But if you're forcing a group of people to recite a land acknowledgement, the next question needs to be, what are you going to do about it? And if you don't have an answer for that, don't recite a land acknowledgement, because it really does nothing but perpetuates I don't want to say a victim mentality amongst Indigenous. It takes away the autonomy of Indigenous peoples to move forward. So I've always been really challenged by this, and it's something where I really encourage people that I work with, that groups that I talk to, maybe it's time to move beyond the land acknowledgement. Maybe we're not going to say land acknowledgement unless we can then follow it up with concrete actions. The challenge is the concrete actions are hard to take. We're in a movement right now where a lot of Indigenous people will talk about land back. What does land back mean? I mean, literally, is it giving land back, the unceded Indigenous lands back to Indigenous peoples? Well, that would mean most of Canada would no longer be Canada. So we're talking about, if you're going to make that acknowledgement that this land is owned by Mohawk people, well then move. Like then if that is your acknowledgement, then your next action has to be like, oh, I'm on stolen land. I should not be taking part in this. It's time for me to leave and give the deed to my house to the Mohawk community. And if you're not willing to do that, your land acknowledgement isn't doing it. It's not progressing. Yeah, sorry, I kind of ranted there, but
that's okay. No, I think that's very on point. I would then ask, I mean, for someone like a teacher who does have a lot of power over students, but also is working within an institution that might be really hesitant to make those concrete changes, what can settler educators do to support maybe following Indigenous lead on what these changes need to look like?
Yeah.
Or is that something that they should be doing?
Well, yes. I think as settlers in Canada is somebody who acknowledged the pain and suffering done by the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples, that there is a moral prerogative to do something about it. But to push Indigenous peoples aside and take the lead on that, that's not doing something. That is further propagating this paternalistic relationship between settlers and Indigenous people. Really, I talk more about creating space. I think something that I like that you just touched on was this power dynamic. understanding that is educators, because just by virtue of being an educator, you have a significant power dynamic over the students you're working with. Just by virtue of me working in social services, I have a significant power dynamic over the people that I'm working with. So we can always try and to work in egalitarian kind of means, more laterally as possible. But if you don't recognize that power dynamic is heavily favored in the educator and the social service worker, you're not recognizing the reality of the situation. So to follow that up, it means that, in your institutions that you work with, if you're going to acknowledge the pain and suffering they've done, you now have moral prerogative to make changes there. So I would then ask, not to put that weight on, what can Indigenous communities? No, where can I use my power? Where can I then invest this to move this forward? Where can I make space for Indigenous peoples? It is a lot of times going to your administration. I don't think the program in Chateauguay, it didn't happen because one principal, one member of the New Frontier School Board was like, holy shit, we're doing something horrible, we need to change it. It came because teachers are like, this system is failing our students. As we know, most people that get into education, they're not getting in there to perpetuate harm. Most people that work in the social services are not there to perpetuate harm. We might, through our inaction, still perpetuate that harm. But I think the reason we have classes like this is so that you understand, this global view exists where we're doing this. Now I have a moral prerogative to do something about it. So you're going to your principals, you're going to your school boards and be like, we're not just going to talk about Orange T-shirt Day. Let's talk about how does the effects of residential schools play out in our students' lives. What could we do as an institution to address that? And the next question should be, do we have Indigenous representation in this decision-making body? And if we don't, how do we invite that? How do we create spaces that is not tokenistic, where Indigenous peoples can come in and take part in that discussion? The fact is, I'm not an educator. That's not what my background is. But I worked with educators. Again, I look at the New Frontier School Board is, again, not a perfect model. But after we developed our relationship of when can you come in and work on this class, it was like, wow, you know what? Some of the things you're saying need to be heard by our minister. So I met with the principals and vice principals at that school, and we did an Indigenous 101 in that school. I was like, oh wow, this is something our directors need to know. So then every year I was invited back to their first PE day of the Frontier School Board. So we'd have hundreds of educators, teachers mostly, that would come in and if they wanted to, take a class with me. The first workshop we did, the first Indigenous 101 we did, we had 8 members of that school board there. One was a director, one was a principal I already knew, 3 were teachers, and then 3 more were janitors. And I was like, okay, whatever, it's a small group, we're going to have lots of time to discuss. Thankfully, the next year we did it, we had standing room only. We had over 50 educators in the room with us, and it was good to see, but that would have never happened if those janitors didn't come and tell their colleagues, like, hey, this is really interesting what I did last year, maybe you want to take part of it today. If it wasn't for the fact that I was in the school already, and the teachers who are working with me could tell, we've seen a positive benefit by having psychosocial supports being offered to our Indigenous student population. So these things all can move forward. And again, we didn't get in this situation overnight. 1492 didn't happen, and by 1493, we didn't have a situation where a genocide was perpetuated. We had the beginning of a genocide, but these solutions aren't going to happen overnight. Right. These solutions are going to happen when more and more educators take courses like this, which is part of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations, was to have more education around here. But what do you do with this education? Again, it's like a land acknowledgement. If you're not willing to take this learning and then somehow incorporate it into your practice, and then use that practice to advocate, to reconcile, we just end up perpetuating the same challenges, the same intergenerational trauma. You know, there needs to be a period where, you know, there needs to be a period where somebody comes to me and like, wait, what are actually the effects of intergenerational trauma that you're experiencing? We know you didn't go to a residential school, but like, how has that affected you today? And they're like, okay, well, here are things we can do. Here are things we do so if I was to have children, they're not going to have that same pain and suffering being transferred from me. You know, with my nieces and nephews, I don't want to see that pain transferred onto them that my siblings have been raised with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Wayne.
No problem.
Yeah.
Sorry I'm so ranty.
Rants are encouraged here. Thank you so much. I guess, is there anything else that you would want to share, knowing that we'll also have you join us next Monday for an open discussion of some of these things? If you want to bring some questions based on this, have some in mind that you want to engage with Wayne on. If you want him to rant more, we can let that happen too. But is there anything else on all of this, or anything else that you wanted to add?
You know, I'm definitely looking forward to maybe reviewing this talk ourselves, and I think by next week I'll definitely have more things that I'll want to share. But I also encourage the students of your class to provide questions. You know, it definitely a good opportunity to talk to somebody who's had experience working within educational institutions. Some of my best friends are educators. But yeah, I'm looking forward to next week.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing so much. I think that I want to appreciate whenever someone shares their experiences and their expertise. But yeah, this was particularly useful. Thank you.
Miigwech.